as the New Testament is just as God breathed, and it's so important to us. The New Testament, the Old Testament is what set us up for the New Testament. It's all the material that went into so that we could see that Jesus was the fulfillment of it, so that we can see that the church is the fulfillment of it, so that everything we can see about it is, makes the Old Testament necessary. So I just wanted to clear that up right off the bat. The Old Testament really, really matters just as much as anything we read in the New Testament. Now, granted, the New Testament is the sort of the elaboration of it, the fulfillment of it, the filling it more full. But just because, you go to a restaurant, or I guess nobody goes to restaurants anymore, just because you go to a restaurant and, you have a half a glass of iced tea and you ask to be filled up. That's what the New Testament does. It fills it up. But that doesn't mean what was there before is worthless. So I just wanted to establish that right off the top so that we can understand that, the Old Testament, just as much as the New Testament, the Old Testament is God's revelation of himself. And if there's only one thing you understand about what the Old Testament is, it's God's revelation of himself. It's God showing to us who he is. We don't read the Old Testament to learn history. We don't read the Old Testament for its factual details. We read it to know God. That's what matters. That's what it's there for. It's to teach us who God is and what he is like. Now, just so you don't get the wrong idea, it is historical. It is showing us how God is the God of his people in real life. It's not just metaphor. It's not just philosophy. It's not just history. It's everyday God in everyday human lives. That's what it's the story of. So I should make very clear from the start that I believe that what is recorded for us in the Old Testament is history. It happened. It's not just fiction. It's not fantasy. It's not mythology. It's not metaphor, even though some of it is metaphorical, but it happened. It's historical. These people really existed and the things really happened. And so that's important to establish from the beginning too. Those are just sort of some overview concepts as we launch into it. Now, I want to give you some tools so that you can understand what the Old Testament, how it's structured, and how you can remember what's going on, because it helps if we just have some framework, like a skeleton, to help us understand how this is. So if we start with just the general framework of sort of two of the three most important people in the Old Testament. Moses would be the other one, who's pretty important. But these two people, if you want to think of it this way, Abraham is 2,000, David is 1,000, and Jesus is 0. So we have these millennial brackets just that help us to frame when did these things happen and how do these people fit into each other. Abraham's 2,000, David is 1,000, Jesus is 0. Now, the next piece to get a hold of the structure is that a lot of people don't seem to people realize, Abraham and David, fine, but a lot of people don't realize this next piece. To get a grasp on the structure, the Old Testament really often breaks down into 400-year blocks. Not exactly, but if you're always thinking in terms of 400s, that'll give you a great amount of guidance to understanding the Old Testament. So starting with Abraham at 2000 BC, we have approximately 400 years of patriarchs. And patriarchs would be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We have about 400 years of patriarchs. We have about 400 years in Egypt. Not all of it was slavery. I wrote on the slide, slavery in Egypt. Not all of their 400 years were slavery. because they were there for a while with Joseph and things got settled in. And it was after a while that there came along a Pharaoh who didn't know who Joseph was. But slavery in Egypt, roughly 400 years. The time of the judges, roughly 400 years. Now, Judges never gives us much of any historical markers, so there may be some overlap in different directions, but if you generally think of the time of the Judges as 400 years, the time of the monarchy from King Saul in about 1050 BC till when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and carried the people into exile in 586 BC, again, is almost exactly 400 years. The time of the prophets, which would include people like Elijah and Elisha, who were during the monarchy, and Isaiah, who was during the monarchy, and down into some of the other prophets who were in the exile, like Daniel and Ezekiel, Malachi, Zechariah. The time of the prophets is roughly 400 years. And then there's a period of silence between the last book of the Bible. The last book of the Bible for us is Malachi, but the last book of the Jewish Bible is Second Chronicles. And the Chronicles was probably written around the same time that Malachi was. So when the Old Testament canon, when the writing of the Old Testament closed in about 400 BC, till John the Baptist shows up on the scene in about 4 BC, is roughly 400 years. So if that helps, that if you're really trying to remember how things fit together in the Old Testament, think about Abraham at 2000, David at 1000. And you can see all these brackets, like on the slide, all these bracketed periods of roughly 400 years. They're certainly not exactly 400 years, but it's just to give us a framework of how things happen, right? So that you have some kind of grasp. Oh, okay, that helps me to see that because now I have some sort of a sense of how things happen. Now, isn't it intriguing, though, that God worked in this structure of numbers, and he often did that. I mean, in the same sense, the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And we know that the flood was 40 days and 40 nights. We know that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. And so we have these numerical structures that are to some extent historical, but they're certainly symbolic as well. And so there's often in the numbers that we read in the Bible often have a symbolic import as well as a historical one. So it's just interesting how that all works out. Now, just to toss this in as a fun thing, that because God seems to work so often with this structure of 40 and 400, we do happen to be almost exactly 4,000 years from Abraham when God first called the nation. There are some people that are wondering if we're in the end times, and that's a whole different course. But it's interesting that we are now at 4,000 years from Abraham. So these are interesting times because we know that God works in numbers. So anyway, hopefully that'll give you an overview that's really useful to you. And so we should start then with a historical overview. Okay? So let's go to that. If we start at the beginning, the very beginning, right? Genesis 2 tells us about the Garden of Eden. We have no idea what kind of timeline to put on that. And so that's why I started at Abraham at 2000. That's not exactly where biblical history starts, but we have no idea what kind of a timeline to put on Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. There are enough clues in Genesis 2, though, that make us fairly confident in saying that the Garden of Eden was probably in what we are now calling Kuwait, right at the top of the Persian Gulf, right where the Tigris and Euphrates drain into the Persian Gulf. That's probably where the Garden of Eden was. And at the time, well, we don't exactly know what time it was, so I won't go into that. So we don't really get to any kind of a timeline uh, until we get to Genesis chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel story. Um, just to be clear, though, before I talk about the Tower of Babel story, I take Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, Enoch, Noah, and the flood to be historical people and historical events. And all the people that are listed there in Genesis 1 through Genesis 10, I take to be historical people and historical places and historical events, just to make that clear. There can be, again, that's different conversations, but I just wanted to say that. The story obviously focuses on the Middle East and not on any other part of the world. It doesn't concern itself with any other part of the world until much later. So we pick up a more definite timeline when we get to the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. With the historical information we have in Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, we can pin this event to the second half of the third millennium BC, which means it probably happened sometime between 2500 BC and 2000 BC when we meet Abraham. Remember, Abraham's at 2000. And so the Tower of Babel could have happened several generations before Abraham. It's very possible that the Tower of Babel, that one of the reasons that Abraham's father, Terah, left the region of Ur of the Chaldees, and you can see that sort of in the middle of that map, a little bit up and to the right where that ziggurat picture is. It's possible that one of the reasons Terah left the Ur of the Chaldees was because of the Tower of Babel event. Joshua, I think it's Joshua 24, tells us that Terah was a polytheist, that he was a pagan as far as anybody knows, and he may have gotten caught up in what happened in the Tower of Babel, and that's one of the reasons they left as a family and went to Haran. And that would put the Tower of Babel, again, probably in about 2200, even 2100 BC. Again, we don't know exactly where Abraham is, even though we can get close to it. The scattering of the people was probably due to an invasion. History records for us that the Sumerians were attacked by an outside group and they were scattered. And if this was the invasion of the Tower of Babel, and if this was the scattering of the language groups, it would have sent all those residents splattering out into the surrounding territories, and it probably sent Abram's father, Terah, north along the Euphrates River. You can see the Euphrates River is on the lower left there, up the Euphrates River to Haran, where they settled in. That's where we first start to pick up any kind of distinct historic timeline and date, is at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. You can see I picked a map that took us from Ur up to Babylon and up to Haran, where Terah took his family, and he took Abram and Sarai up there, and Lot and other family members. And this would have been right around, as I said, 2200, 2100 BC, just before. I casually put Abraham at 2000. But it was there in Haran that God called Abraham to be the ancestor of what he called his covenant people. And the concept of covenant, we're going to find, is very important in the Old Testament scriptures. And here's where it begins. It begins at Genesis 12, when God makes a covenant with Abraham. Now, God had made covenants with Noah before Abraham, and God had made a covenant with Adam as well. But so these covenants are important. It is through the covenant and through the children of Abraham that God would reveal himself to the world. See, everything that happened in Genesis 1 through 11, it's a very unique section of Scripture. After we get to Genesis 12, Scripture has a certain uniformity to it from there until the end of the Old Testament canon, which was Malachi or Second Chronicles. But it's going to be all the disastrous things that happen in Genesis 1 through 11. Adam and Eve disobeying God and being cast out of the Garden of Eden. Certainly whatever that was at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, where it talks about the Nephilim, certainly the flood, and then we get the Tower of Babel. It's just all these almost terrible things that are happening, but that God's plan to resolve any of that, God's plan of redemption, is a plan of covenant. Covenant is how he's going to reveal himself to the world. And actually, our word testament is a synonym for the word covenant. It's really, if you wanted to use this language, in our Bible, we have an old covenant and the new covenant, or the former covenant and the post covenant. But that's what a covenant is. It's a contract, it's a promise, and it's the covenant that God is going to reveal himself to the world. And in that way, it's through the covenant that God is going to correct the Eden problem. The Eden problem is sin. And we're going to see sin on every page of the Bible between Genesis 3 and Revelation 22, where sin is done away with and sin is defeated. It's the covenant that is going to deal with the Eden problem of sin. It's also the covenant that's going to deal with the Babel problem. The Babel problem is that people don't understand God properly. And it's essential that we understand God properly, as he really is. And so that's what the covenant is all about. It's God revealing himself as he truly is in response to the Babel problem. And it's also dealing with the issue of human sin, which is the Eden problem. And these two events sort of bookend Genesis 1 through 11. So just trying to give you this historical overview. So he brought Abraham, as you can see on this slide, he brought Abraham to the promised land. See, he dropped down from Haran down through, down along the waterways. They always had to travel along the waterways, which is why they wouldn't just cut from over to Jerusalem, right? You know why they don't cut across there? Because there's no water to drink. They follow the Euphrates up until they reach sort of the Haran area, and then they have to cut across a short distance until they get to more waterways, and they can descend next to those down into Canaan. That's why they would have gone in that direction. But he brought Abraham then south from Haran down along the waterway into the promised land, what he called the promised land. And this was, at the time, it was known as Canaan. And it was there that Abraham and his descendants lived on the brink of extinction for about 400 years. Here's our first 400-year block: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And they lived in the promised land, which wasn't much of a land to speak about. If you would look at it for desirability, you wouldn't say, oh, this is an awesome place. It was probably not an awesome place, but it was still God's chosen place. And it was there that they lived for roughly that time, just to give you that model, right? We go back to, right, the patriarchs, 400 years. So Abraham, I'm giving you a historical overview tonight. Tonight is history. Next week, we'll talk about literature. And the following week, we'll talk about theology of the Old Testament. So tonight is the historical overview so that you have some kind of a grasp of what's happening all during when the Old Testament was written. So under Joseph, for the protection of the whole family, they emigrated south along the Mediterranean Sea down into Egypt, up into the land of Goshen is where the Bible says they stayed. And you can see Goshen up there in the Nile Delta region. It was not a land that was worth much for farming or for the things that most of the Egyptians did, which is why Pharaoh told Joseph that he and his family could stay there. But it was actually an excellent place for sheep herders and goat herders, which is what the children of Israel were. They had sheep and goats, and so Pharaoh put them in the land of Goshen up there in the Delta region. And it was there that they stayed for roughly another 400 years. Remember, we're thinking in 400-year blocks. So if we're thinking roughly, and we are thinking roughly, if Abraham was somewhere from about 2100 BC to roughly 1700 BC, then we're going to put the time of slavery from roughly 1700 to roughly 1300 BC, somewhere in that picture. Nobody knows exactly where these things belong. But Joseph and the whole family emigrated from Canaan down to Egypt, where they stayed for roughly 400 years. You know the story. We don't know much about the time between Joseph, who could have been in around 1700 BC, and Moses, who came in possibly around 1300 BC. We hardly know anything about those 400 years. But you know the little bit that we do know. A series of pharaohs ruled the land, as you might expect, and pharaohs came along who didn't know anything about Joseph and any agreement that Joseph had with the people, and the pharaoh conscripted them for labor, which may have been somewhat innocent at first. It's impossible to know, but it just may have been possible that the pharaoh needed some work done and the Israelites were willing to do it. But even if it started off friendly, it certainly became oppressive as the years went by. And for 400 years, or at least part of that 400-year time, and again, we don't know how long they were actually enslaved. See, these are things that we don't know historically, but in ways it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was actually 150 years when they were actually slaves, or whether it was more like 300. As far as the biblical story is concerned, they needed to be redeemed. And so after the 400 years of their presence in Canaan, they had 400 years of a presence in Goshen in northern Egypt. And then God brought them out of the land under the leadership of Moses. And that's what the book of Exodus, right? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy is all about, the 5 books of Moses. And they began their emigration back to Canaan. You can see some of these brown lines in the map. These are various ideas and speculations as to where the Israelites escaped from Egypt, how they would have gone across this series of lakes. Those series of lakes are actually more like swamps and bogs and lakes, and it's a messy place where chariots cannot easily go. And that's where God told them to escape rather than by the way of the sea, because by the way of the sea, if you're way up north by the Mediterranean Sea, by the way of the sea, first of all, there were a series of Egyptian fortresses all along the Mediterranean. And second of all, that's an easy place for chariots and horses to move. And so God said, don't go by the way of the sea, go the way I tell you. And so they probably crossed somewhere in the middle here where some of these brown lines go. And under the leadership of Moses, they emigrate Egypt after 400 years and go back to Canaan, the land that God had promised them. Now, they go down to Sinai. Now, if you, I don't have a picture of Sinai down in the Sinai Peninsula, but they would have left the land here and then turned south after they got into the Sinai Peninsula, after they passed the Red Sea, they would have turned south and gone down to Sinai, and that's where they received the law. And Moses was up with the Lord. If you remember the story of Sinai in about Exodus 19 or so, when Moses was receiving the law, remember he was on Sinai for 40 days. Again, the same numbers that we're seeing everywhere, 40s and 400s. At Sinai, they received the law, which is the next great phase of the covenant. That God is revealing himself to them. That's what the Old Testament is. God revealing himself to people in history. Now, you know that when they reached the land of Canaan, they displayed such a great lack of faith in God and in God's promises and in the covenant. What it means is that they weren't buying into the covenant. They didn't believe God. They were not. They didn't understand who God really was. The whole purpose of the covenant was so that they would understand God as he really is, but they did not trust the contract. They didn't trust the covenant, and they didn't trust the promises of God that he had made in the covenant. And as a result, they spent 40 years. Again, we've got this number 40. They spent 40 years wandering somewhat aimlessly because they were aimless as far as their faith was concerned. They were wandering as far as their faith was concerned. And so God made the punishment fit the crime. If you're really wandering and if you're really aimless, then I'll show you wandering and I'll show you aimless and I'll use that to teach you. And he used those 40 years to teach them all about himself. Again, these are the issues of the covenant. If they weren't ready to enter the land because they didn't understand who God was and they didn't understand the covenant, then what he wanted to teach them was, okay, we'll take 40 years and teach you all about who God is and teach you all about how the covenant works. So that's what those 40 years were about. So after 40 years, they went back to the land of Canaan, and Joshua led them into the land. Oh, this is the northern part of the land. Okay. Joshua led them back in the land after conquering two cities, Jericho and Ai. They were attacked by a coalition of kings from the south. The kings of Canaan could see what was happening here, and after conquering only two cities, they were attacked by a coalition of kings from the south, and they defended themselves. You know, people accuse God. I'm just tossing this in for this bonus. People accuse God of being so awful and so cruel. Oh, he sent those Israelites in to slaughter the population. Actually, he did not. He sent them in the land to drive them out of the land. What he wanted them to do was leave. This is the land of the Israelites. It's not your land. Leave. But they attacked Joshua. They attacked the Israelites from the south, and Joshua and the Israelites defending themselves, and in the process inherited all of those cities because their kings were killed and their armies were destroyed. Well, now they owned the middle land and all of the south highlands, the mountainous parts. And then they were attacked by a coalition of kings from the north. Again, they defended themselves and they won. And so they inherited all of those cities in the north. Now, with barely attacking a city, they owned all of the highlands of the land of Canaan. They possessed the hill country, which is exactly what archaeologists tell us, and it's exactly what the Bible tells us. But they never took the rest of the land. They possessed it in combination with the Canaanites, which shows that they still did not understand who God was, and they still did not understand what the covenant was. All they owned was the highlands and the plains. The down lower parts, the farmlands, the fertile parts, still belonged to the Canaanites and to the Philistines. So, over the next several centuries, remember the time of the judges probably covered about 400 years. But there may have been some overlap. It's hard to tell because we're giving almost no historical markers in the book of Judges. But if you sort of add up, do the math in the book of Judges, it lasts about 400 years. So we'll just say that for a round number because it fits in with the schema and it does match what Judges is telling us. Over the next several centuries, they were led by their own tribal leadership, which were supposed to honor the covenant and let God be their king. It was a disaster. They were terrible at this game. They had not learned much from the 40 years in the wilderness. They don't seem to have learned much from the 400 years in Egypt. By the time we get to the 400 years of the Judges, it's a disaster. They fell away from God. It's recorded for us in the 21 or 22 chapters of the book of Judges. It was a disastrous era of faithlessness, and they constantly fell prey to invaders because they had never obeyed God and taken the entire land. And so they were attacked by Philistines and Ammonites and Amalekites, Moabites, Edomites. It's just this constant misery because they had not obeyed God. And God allowed this to teach them the consequences of faithlessness. One of the ways we learn that we've made terrible mistakes is to bear the consequences of those mistakes. And that's what we see in the book of Judges, and it's a terrible time for the people. Along came Samuel, and the people had a huge protest rally. We could just picture that. Just watch the evening news. The people had a huge protest rally because they wanted a king like the other nations. And Samuel said, "You have a king. You don't follow the king you have. Why do you want another king?" But they said they wanted a king, and so they chose Saul, who they thought was a good choice at the time because he was tall. But it turned out to be a terrible choice. And it showed that they had not learned much from their whole time of the Judges. By the time of Saul's death, they were no better off militarily, economically, or spiritually than when Joshua had died. So now God's going to step in. Okay, you people, you don't know, you're not catching on. You're not learning. You're not doing these things. So God stepped in and God chose David. So now we're at 1000 BC. Remember, I gave you the general framework: Abraham at 2000, David at 1000. We had a 400 year of the patriarchs. We had a 400 year of Egyptian, and then we have 400 years of the judges, wherever that fits. So now we're to 1000 BC. And under David, David was a military genius, and he was able to take the rest of the land. It was the first time ever that they had had possession of all of the land that God had promised to Abraham. As you know, during the time of Abraham, it was only a promise to Abraham. Abraham didn't actually own any of the land except a grave he bought for Sarah. Under the children of Israel, they never owned the land. They were just a tribal group. And when they came back under Joshua, they never took the whole land. They weren't living up to the covenant or honoring the God of the covenant. But under David, at 1000 BC, finally, we have this where they take possession of the rest of the land, something Joshua was not even able to do because of the faithlessness of the people. And he united it. It's called the United Monarchy. The United Monarchy has 3 kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. So at this point, God renewed the covenant with David. It's in 1 Samuel 5 or 7, where God renews the covenant with David, the exact one that he had made with Abraham. And then again with Moses, he now makes this covenant with David, and he says, the people need to understand who I am, and the people need to understand what this contract is all about. And so under David, he makes this covenant, and Israel is finally a nation. You can see the picture of it here on the map. They are finally a nation, and they possessed all of the land that God had promised. So David was succeeded by his son Solomon, and despite what we're taught in Sunday school as children, Solomon was not a good king. He was greatly compromised with his pagan wives, and he was taxing the people to death, and he was not a good king. But the kingdom was united under Solomon. Things went mostly downhill from there. After Solomon, and remember there are 400 years of monarchy from King Saul till when the nation ended. They're about 400 years. So you can remember all of the kings that we read about in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are all during this 400-year period. And after Solomon, there was a bloodless civil war. The kingdom split. The kingdom split into north and south. And the northern section was called Israel, and the southern section was called Judah. The kings in the north were a godless bunch. They never had a good king in their entire history. Since we're talking about the history tonight, the northern kings, they never had a good king among the whole bunch of them. It was a mess, which showed they hadn't really learned anything from Saul. They hadn't learned anything from the period of Judges. They hadn't learned anything from the 40 years of wilderness wandering, etc. And after decades of warnings from the prophets, oh, there's Israel and Judah. I knew, I thought I had it somewhere. Israel and Judah divided in half. You can see right at Jericho and Ai where Joshua had entered the land. And after decades and decades and decades of warning from various prophets, including people like Elijah and Elisha, those are the most famous ones that were talking to the kings of the north, the kings of Israel. And after several hundred years of God's patience with them and bringing them prophets to try to restore them to the Lord, the Assyrians came in 722 BC and wiped them out. And I mean really wiped them out. The tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, are called the lost tribes. They are gone to history. We have no idea what happened to them. No one knows what happened to them. They are lost. They're just gone. They were deported by Assyria and they were assimilated into other cultures. And we have no idea. They're the lost 10 tribes. If you ever hear that phrase, that's what that's talking about. Meanwhile, in the south, there were some good kings, but they were mostly bad. And that's why the South lasted longer, because they had some good kings who were trying to lead them towards God. And God sent them prophets to warn them also. And those are the prophets Isaiah and I'm trying to think who else was to the southern kingdom in particular. And mostly their message was, don't let happen to you what happened to your brothers in the north, because God only has so much, will only endure so much sin before he will move in. And he said, turn back to God. And that was the message of the prophets. Turn back to God. Don't be like your apostate brothers in the north. So while the Assyrian Empire started to shrink, they were being attacked by other people groups. The Babylonian Empire grew. Do you see how Babylon there in the southern part of Assyria? The Babylonian Empire began to make waves in Judah. And you can see now the Babylonian Empire is much bigger than Assyria ever was. And in 586 BC, almost exactly 400 years after Saul had been elected king. The Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem. They crushed Judah. They burned the temple. They killed much of the population, and they carried exiles away into Babylon. And those are people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Ezekiel was one of the exiles. Um, the whole exilic tribe, 400 years. That's where the books of Daniel and Ezekiel come into the story. But the story doesn't end there. You'd think, well, that does it end. You know, they've lost the land. The 10 tribes are lost and gone. The 2 tribes of Judah have been exiled to Babylon, and most of them have been killed. Some have been left behind. But the story doesn't end there. For 70 years, the Judahites are in exile in Babylon. And that's where we have the prophetic works of, as I mentioned, Ezekiel and Daniel. It's also where we have the prophetic works of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says after 70 years, he prophesies, after 70 years, you will be allowed to return to the land. And so aside from the books of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, we know almost nothing about those 70 years, just like we know almost nothing about the 400 years they were in Egypt. We're virtually clueless about all of that. But Babylon then falls to Persia, which was the next empire, under a king named King Cyrus. The exiles are allowed to return. Now here's the Persian Empire. You can see how much bigger it is than the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonian Empire was so much bigger than the Assyrian Empire. But Cyrus gave a decree that the people could return to their land. And this is the period in Israel known as the post-exilic period. Exile, post-exile. So we have just to review some of the history, we have the time of the patriarchs, about 400 years. We have the time of the slavery, or in Egypt, for about 400 years. We have the time of the judges, which is about 400 years. We have the time of the monarchy, which is about 400 years. And part of that is a united monarchy and then a divided monarchy. And then we have the time of the exile, 70 years, and then they come back. And that's the post-exilic period. And it's during the post-exilic period, after the exile, it's here that we get the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about the return from exile. This is where we get Malachi. We get 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Some of these prophetic books, we don't exactly know when they're written. There's no kind of a date stamp in them to give us a clue. They are just, prophetic works that we learn from. But so there's about a 400-year prophetic history. The prophets who start in about 800 BC with Elijah and Elisha, carrying all the way down to Malachi in about 400 BC. So again, another 400-year section that covers the era of the 400-year era of the prophets, covers the united monarchy, the divided monarchy, the exile, and the post-exilic time. And we have 400 years there of prophetic messages to the people of God. And then it is after this, after Malachi and 2nd Chronicles were written in roughly 400 BC, where the Old Testament era comes to an end. The Old Testament canon comes to an end, and there turns out to be 400 years of silence. between Malachi and Second Chronicles in about 440 BC, till we get to the time of John the Baptist and Jesus in what we call zero. It wasn't technically zero, but there's about 400 years in all that period. So if you remember the flows, and I'll repeat them again, just to give you this historical structure. We have Abraham in 2000 BC and David in 1000 BC. And then we have roughly 6 or 7 periods. I'd have to go back, I never counted them. 6 or 7 periods, 6 periods of 400 years. Now you can't do the math because there's overlap. But we have roughly 6 periods of 400 years that carry us from Abraham to Jesus. Now, we also have movement, just so you can see the movement of history. Remember, we started in Kuwait, in the region of Ur of the Chaldees, in what was not too far from Babylon. You see Babylon there on the map? And they went from Babylon over to Canaan. They went from Canaan down to Egypt and back to Canaan. And then, well, Abraham went to Egypt several times. So they go from Babylon to Canaan, back and forth to Egypt, and then they go back to Babylon under the Babylonian Empire. And then under Cyrus, then they come back to Canaan. So you see the whole flow of history is this arc from Babylon to Canaan, back to Babylon, back to Canaan. Just so you get that kind of historical flow. And between those arcs from Babylon to Canaan and back again several times, we get several troughs down into Egypt. Abraham went down into Egypt several times, and obviously Joseph and all the people went down into Egypt. So we have that as a framework too. Babylon to Canaan to Babylon to Canaan, right? And so hopefully that gives you the overview. Hey, Matt.
Hey.
Good morning.
Sorry, I want to pop back in here, but I know we're getting to the end of the session where we're going to take some questions and answers.
We are, because I didn't never know how long this material is going to last.
Well, I love it. I'm sure everyone coming into nice weather on a Sunday afternoon doesn't mind a shortened class. No one will be upset.
Nobody's going to complain.
So now we're down to that Q&A. Being able to see some of those. Obviously, we're doing an overview. The Old Testament has so much in it that spending 3 Sundays talking about it, we got to really do a pretty big overview. We got to get that plane pretty high up in the sky. And I think you've done a really great job giving us a historical structure for understanding how everything fits. And it's interesting, right, that it's not apparently written, right? One thing that you keep talking about, even Malachi, and comes last, and that happens to fit the timeline of the Old Testament, but other books don't necessarily fit the timeline. So the Old Testament definitely isn't written entirely chronologically.
It's not, and that's what confuses people when they read it. But that's what we'll talk about next week when we talk about the literature, how the Old Testament is structured in its literature.
Yeah.
So that's what next week is all about, so that, hopefully you can understand that we have seen, if you get some kind of a grasp of the historical flow, it helps you to understand the books that you're reading. And, okay, now I understand where these fit in. So that makes more sense to me. And then when we talk about literature next week, and you understand how those fit with the historical structure, it just should help you to really grasp how the Old Testament works, and people aren't so confused after they get a little bit of structure under their belts.
Yeah. So you've graciously given us this beautiful slide that says Q&A, which means we're at that point. We're at that point where we get to ask some questions, see if we can stump the teacher.
Yeah, because there's only 13. There's only 2,000 years of history and about what, 1,200 pages of text to ask your questions.
Yeah, so I'm gonna unmute everyone. If you would like, you can essentially wait, let me see if I figure this out. I'm trying to unmute everyone. Unmute all attendees. Yeah, so if you have a question, you can make your mic live and ask it. Hopefully you're able to do that. So Desiree just unmuted her
Oh,
mic. Maybe that's because she's got a question.
yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was in regards to you talked about Malachi and Chronicles being written roughly about the same time. Was it both First and Second Chronicles that was written about the same time as Malachi?
Oh, hang on, Jim. I in all that, I think I muted your microphone too. Now I can't hear you. How rude of me. Give me 1 second. All right, there you go. We can hear you now.
Now am I unmuted?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yes, First and Second Chronicles are grouped where they are. We'll talk about this next week. They're grouped with the historical books because they review the history. But as far as that, there isn't anything in them that tells us who wrote them or when they were written. But every indication in them, as far as the grammar and the structure and the kind of terminology that's used, points us to around 450 BC. And, so both First and Second Chronicles were written during that time. We may talk about it next week too. We also do not know when First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings were written, nor do we know who wrote them. But the structure and terminology in Samuel and Kings is much more ancient than the terminology in Chronicles. So they were probably written much earlier, though we don't know when. But Chronicles was probably one of the last, if not the last, books that were written.
Okay. So another question, in regards to the 10 tribes being up north, what, I guess, does history say or the Bible say about how the Assyrians just stopped right above the Judah and the last two tribes? Like what stopped them from trying to overtake the rest of the
Yeah,
tribes?
yeah, thank you. They did not stop. They intended to take Judah. And actually, if you turn to Second Chronicles 32, Second Chronicles 32, verse 1 tells us that the Assyrians were tromping through Judah, burning and destroying cities. And they had not destroyed all of the cities, but they were hitting the high points, and they came to Jerusalem. Second Chronicles 32 tells us that when they came to besiege Jerusalem, King Hezekiah was the king at the time, and he called Isaiah to Jerusalem. Well, Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. He called Isaiah to the castle and said, pray for us, spare us. What can we do to be saved? Sort of the same question the Philippian jailer asked Paul in Acts chapter 16. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "What do I have to do to be saved?" And they prayed to the Lord, and the Lord gave Isaiah the message that the Assyrians would not conquer Jerusalem. And the text right at the end of First or Second Chronicles 32 tells us that the Assyrians deserted their siege of Jerusalem, um, and that they went back to the capital city of Nineveh, and they never came back again to take the rest of Judah. So Judah was allowed to continue on for another 150 years. Um, and they went through, well, Hezekiah was a fairly good king. Then they went through some terrible kings, some godless kings, and God was threatening them with the prophets. If you don't straighten up and fly right, I will take you away just like I took your northern 10 brothers away. But that's when King Josiah became king, and Josiah was probably one of the best kings that Judah ever had. And God, because they had a good uh, king, God spared the nation. Josiah was followed, however, by some horrible kings, some of the most godless kings around. And God said, "Okay, we're done." And the Babylonians came in at 586, and that was the end. So the brief answer to your question is the Assyrians did come into Judah, and they tried to take it, but God stopped them. There are questions from anyone else?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question. So,
Sure.
Anyways, go for
so
it.
we talked about like 40 and 400 in numbers. I'm wondering where is it? I don't know who told me this, but like certain numbers in regards to like the number 12 meaning representation or the number 7 being completion. How is it that we've been able to define what some of these numbers are? And is there a definition for like 40 or 400?
Yes, yes. We usually define, there's a whole sort of biblical science called numerology, but it's also part of ancient cultures as well. It's not just unique to the Bible, where sometimes numbers are used not because they're historical, but because of their either symbolic significance or their theological significance. And through history, we have learned that 7 represents perfection. 10 represents completion. Generally, 3 represents God. 6 represents humanity. 12 is the covenant number. And that's why we see 12 tribes of Israel and Judah, and we have 12 disciples, because 12 is the covenant number. 40 right, 40 is a number of trial, and sort of trial and sometimes punishment. You see the 40 days and 40 nights of the flood that were a time of judgment. The 400 years of slavery in Egypt that we could say is a time of judging the people. Jesus' 40 days of temptation in the wilderness were days of temptation. They weren't judgment, but they were days of trial, just like the slavery in Egypt were 400 years of trial. And so, that's what 40 and 400 generally represent. See, 40 times 10. And remember, I said 10 was the number of completion, and 40 is generally a number of trial. So 400 is a complete trial. You see how you put those two symbols together.
Oh, okay. I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great questions. Any other questions for Jim before we wrap up tonight? Awesome. Well, at that, Jim, let me put my camera on so people can see me talking. Can you give us a maybe a 1 minute or 2 minute overview of where we're going next? You already said that next week we're going to be talking about the literature
Right.
and how everything fits together. What are we doing after that?
Well, next week is literature, so we're going to look at each one of the books of the Old Testament. Don't get scared about that. I'm not going to drone you out. We're going to look at each of the books of the Old Testament, how they fit into this historical structure that I've mentioned tonight. Generally, the books of the Old Testament are in 4 categories. Historical books, prophetic books, things like that. And if we understand each of those, we'll understand how they fit into the categories and understand how the writing of the Old Testament fits into the history of the Old Testament to show us who God is. The week after that, we'll talk about theology. That, okay, we understand this historical flow, Canaan to Babylon to Canaan to Babylon to Canaan, and these 400-year gaps. We've got that flow, and we understand the literature. But what is the Old Testament teaching us? It's not just teaching, in the sense that, okay, I said it's telling us who God is. Yeah, but we need to unpack that a little bit so that we understand what it is teaching us. And, rather than deal with some of that tonight as to how does this historical structure that we're seeing sort of unfold for us what God is like, rather than go into that tonight and steal some of my thunder for 2 weeks from tonight, I'll save that all for the third week when we're going to unpack how does all of this work together to solve the Eden problem, which is the problem of sin, and the Babel problem, which is the problem of understanding God correctly, which is what the Old Testament is all about, the Eden problem and the Babel problem.
That's great. When we get to session 3 in a couple weeks from now, I know that I assume we'll cover this concept, but sometimes the Old Testament, we also have to understand that there's a lot of things in the Old Testament that were written to a specific people in a specific time, and they aren't necessarily things that were intended for us under the new covenant. And then there are other things that are very much that are very valuable, and trying to distinguish between those and some different theological understanding of the audience of the Old Testament and the covenant of God's people, certain things that were for them, and then understanding that. So from a theological perspective, right, there are certain things that right now there's a lot of debate amongst churches about how much of the promises of the Old Testament to God's people are intended for the church today, or were they just for God's people in the Old Testament. So I'm excited to have those conversations about that understanding and trying to figure out where those things overlap. There's great arguments on both sides. There's people who say that there's great scripture in the New Testament that says we've been really enveloped into the people of God and all the promises and the things that kind of come alongside that. But then there's also some understanding that that was for God's chosen people at that time, and it doesn't apply to us today. So how do we take some of those laws and things and figure out what are we supposed to cling to and what are we supposed to not, and what are we supposed to learn from? So I'm excited about those conversations.
That'll make an excellent conversation in 2 weeks. As I said, though, it helps to have some of the historical structure as I gave you tonight, so you understand that it's mostly a sequence of these sort of trials. God is trying to teach the people, and he's trying to reveal himself, and that's why there are all these segments that are 400 years long. It actually happened in history that way. I'm not saying it's all symbolic or that it's all metaphorical. It actually happened. But God works within history in very orderly and instructive ways. So yeah, when we get to that discussion 2 weeks from now about how does the Old Testament carry into what we believe, what you were just talking about, yeah, it's fascinating. The other piece, though, is that we get so used to thinking in New Testament terms because we've been schooled so heavily in New Testament theology. And of course, our understanding of everything depends on Jesus, and they didn't have Jesus. And so their mindset is different because it's pre-Messiah.
Yeah, I'm excited about having those conversations. I hope that everyone who's in the class right now, I hope you're excited as well. And we're